Hi, welcome to the first of many screencasts that you're going to be asked to view this year. This one's going to be on terrestrial biomes. Just so you know, I'm going to try my best to keep these to under 15 minutes each, but I'm going to fail on this very first one because terrestrial biomes is kind of a lot to take on, but let's just get going with it. All right, so we start off apes by studying ecology. Ecology, if you recall, is basically a study of living organisms and how they interact with each other and with other aspects of the non-living parts of their environment. We'll talk quite a bit in this particular screencast about abiotic and biotic factors. So abiotic factors are the non-living aspects of an environment, the non-living things that can influence life. That'd be things like temperature, precipitation, soil chemistry, and so on. Biotic factors would be the different life forms and products of life forms, say like animal waste or dead leaves that can contribute to the life in a given environment. So we start off by looking at a hierarchy of a living system. So we start off with an individual that'd be like, say, like a rabbit. A population would be all the rabbits of a given species that live within a certain area. A community would be all the different organisms that interact with each other in a given area. So that'd be the rabbit plus the grass the rabbit eats, plus the tree under which the rabbit hides when a hawk comes by, plus the hawk that eats the rabbit when the rabbit isn't careful, and so on. An ecosystem is a community of organisms plus all the abiotic factors that are associated with that environment as well. So things like the water that they're drinking and the different chemicals that are in the soil and so on. And at the highest level, we have a biome. So a biome is what we're going to be looking at today. A biome is basically a large area of the Earth, often associated with a given latitudinal zone, and it's characterized by its climate, the amount of precipitation it gets, and the dominant plant and animal life associated with that area. So here's just a little graph associated with this. And by the way, I probably said this in class, but I'll say it now. You don't have to watch my screencast if you don't want to. You could just go through these slides yourselves, but you might miss out on some of the information if you do. So basically, we can divide the planet Earth into a number of different biomes, and depending on which source you look at, there's going to be quite a few variants in what the biomes actually are. I'm trying to keep us to what the College Board is going to expect for students in apes. But basically, we're mostly going to look at the climate graphs of it, temperature, precipitation, and the different abiotic and biotic factors associated with each of these biomes. Now, I really like this graph here. So basically, the two main abiotic factors to consider in determining what biome is going to be where is the amount of temperature, which, by the way, I really don't like. This graph, for some reason, the x-axis is going opposite. So we have low temperatures here and high temperatures here. I don't know, whatever. Okay, and then we have rainfall here. So the idea is this corner is the hot, wet corner, and this is the cold, dry corner. And you can see that basically these are the different biomes of the world. So we have tropical rainforest is going to be hot and wet, and Arctic tundra is going to be very cold and dry, and so on. So basically, what life can live where is primarily dictated by the temperature and precipitation present in a given locality, which is in turn often determined by where it is in terms of latitude. Now, here's a map showing the different biomes of the world. And if you Google this, you're going to find lots of different variations on this. Some of them will have fewer of them, some will have more of them. These are the ones that College Board has. So basically, we can divide the world up into several different zones. Here's a list of them here. I'm not going to read them all to you because you're capable of reading. We're going to go through all of them in turn anyway. But if you take a look, to a large extent, these things are based on certain latitudes. There's other factors that influence it as well, but that's mostly how it works. Now, rainfall comparison is something that we should take into account because rainfall is one of the main abiotic factors that affect biomes. So here we see how many inches of rain we have per year, and we're just doing a bar graph showing, and this is inches. And you got to be prepared with College Board to be ready for any measurement of rainfall. It could be inches, it could be millimeters, it could be centimeters, it could be meters. And so basically what we see here is that we have rainforest has the most, desert and tundra have the least, and then we have grassland and taiga are kind of in between. Now, let's just go through the list of them here. Okay, I see I'm 5 minutes into this. I got to keep going. Tundra is typically associated with the northernmost latitudes. There's not a lot of it in Antarctica. It's too cold even for tundra. But the tundra we can also find in higher elevations as well. But we'll limit ourselves to thinking about it in terms of the extreme northern. So basically, we have is a cold, treeless area dominated by grasses and mosses and lichens. And basically, it has not a whole lot of life most of the time of the year. If you go there most of the time, you're just going to see a lot of snow. It has a very brief growing season. Now, this is what's called a climate graph, and we got to get comfortable reading these. This is one of the main things that College Board wants you to be able to understand when it comes to analyzing biomes, and this is what we'll be working with in class tomorrow. So basically, these can be presented different ways, but we have always an x-axis that is the months of the year. We have January here through December here. We have bars that generally represent precipitation, and then we'll have a line, often with data point dots, that represent the amount of precipitation. You've got to be careful when you look at this to see, which axis is to be used for reading which part of the graph. So I look here, I see that this over here, the red is supposed to be temperature. So the temperature is here, and I see 0 degrees Celsius is up here. So most of this graph, in terms of temperature, is below freezing. And then here we have precipitation, and my precipitation is in millimeters. And I got to be careful with that because you can't just look at it, because some of these are going to be in centimeters, which is obviously 10 times more. So here's the big takeaway. There's actually not much precipitation in the tundra. It's too cold, really, to get a lot of evaporation. And the main thing to note is that the growing season is going to be incredibly short. We only have maybe 3.5 months when the temperature gets above freezing. Got to keep my eye on my stopwatch. And so most of the year is below freezing there. Oh, what did I just do? Let's go back up here. All right, okay, here we go. So the abiotic factors associated with the tundra would be very low temperatures most of the year. Most importantly, the main thing to take away is there's a layer of what's called permafrost. So there's a layer of frozen ground that's so frozen that roots of trees can't grow in it. So there's no trees in the tundra. It's basically just a treeless zone because of this layer of permafrost. And there's very little precipitation. It's really basically like a desert, although the difference is when precipitation does occur through most of the year, it stays on the ground as frozen water, as snow. And the other thing is that the reason it's this way is because the sun is always very low in the sky. Now we're going to talk about the effects of sunlight on temperature and what's called productivity in a later lesson. But for now, let's just say the sun is always going to be low in the sky, and that's the reason why we have these cold temperatures. Now, the biotic factors would be, one of the main ones is low primary productivity. And again, we're going to talk about primary productivity in a later lesson. But basically, think of it as primary productivity is essentially how much light energy is captured by plants and therefore made available to all the other organisms in the ecosystem. Now, as a result of this low productivity, there's low biodiversity. There's not a lot of different types of life there, different types of organisms. It's a very short growing season. And again, we say there's not going to be much in the way of trees. And animals are either going to have to hibernate through the winter months to conserve energy or migrate away in order to find something to eat. Now, the taiga, as you pronounce it, kind of like not a lion, but a taiga. The taiga is, which is also called a boreal forest, boreal meaning northern, is basically a band of coniferous forests that are found in northern latitudes. They are just below the tundra zone. Here's a climatic graph of that. So if you see here, what we have is, again, we have a little bit more precipitation. I got to be careful here. I'm still in millimeters here. Okay, a little bit more precipitation than I had before. And the temperature, it gets above 0 a little bit more of the year, maybe twice as long, half the year it's above. But basically, there's no permafrost. It's not that cold. There's a little bit more precipitation, and that allows for a little bit more life. Now, the abiotic factors would be you have cold winters, short, hot summers, a bit more precipitation as a result of that. There's deep snow in winter. And one thing that's kind of important here is that the pine needles tend to make a fairly acidic soil, and that tends to leach out a lot of the nutrients. So the soil is not particularly conducive to growing many things other than these conifer trees and some fern plants. Biotic factors would be there's A bit more primary productivity because you have a longer growing season, which allows for a little bit more biodiversity. One thing you need to know is the main plant life there is going to be conifers, and also you have quite a few large mammals. Many of them are migratory. Okay, temperate seasonal forests, also known as deciduous or broadleaf forests. These are areas where you have trees that lose their leaves in the winter. So they basically have large leaves that can capture lots of light during the summertime, but then they drop them in the wintertime. They tend to be found in the mid-level latitudes. Here's a climate graph. Now look, whoa, this one looks a little bit different. Sometimes climate graphs are presented this way, where they put the zero line here. And so again, you just got to be ready to roll with the different types of climate graphs. So if I look here, I see that this is millimeters of precipitation. So I got to be careful here. In this case, the temperature's over here. So you've got to read these axes. And believe me, I'm gonna throw them to you both ways to make sure you get used to doing this. So I see here that the temperature gets above zero for more of the year than not. I get quite a bit more precipitation. So the deal here is we would expect the temperature to get below freezing during some point of the year, at least down to it. We get quite a bit of precipitation, and as a result, we get a lot of productivity. So we get 4 seasons. We get a long growing season, quite a bit of rain. The leaves falling down onto the ground tend to decompose, adding nutrients to the soil. So it's worth noting that one of the important abiotic factors here is very rich soils as a result of decomposing leaf matter. Now, primary productivity is going to be fairly high. We're at lower latitudes, so there's more sunlight. It shines for longer. The big leaves are able to soak up more of that energy. Just remember, think of primary productivity as how much light energy is being captured by the plants in a given area. Because there's a bit more primary productivity, there's more biodiversity. And I've already mentioned these other things, so I'm not going to go on with it. Now let's talk about a temperate rainforest. I'm surprised they put this in apes, but here it is. This is basically, I come from a place that has a temperate rainforest. I come from Western Washington, specifically the Olympic Peninsula of Western Washington. And we're kind of famous for having one of the world's most magnificent temperate rainforests. Now, we've all heard of tropical rainforests, which we'll talk about later, but a temperate rainforest is basically a rainforest that occurs in a place where it still gets cold in the winter, maybe freezing, maybe not, but there's a tremendous amount of rainfall. We're talking about meters of rain every year. But if you notice here that the temperatures do get kind of low. Let's see, where's our temperatures? Here's temperatures. This is not getting below freezing on average. So the abiotic factors would be there are 4 seasons. It is temperate. There's a long growing season. There's a very, very high amount of precipitation. And they often occur in places where marine air is pushed up and over mountain ranges, which is the case in Western Washington. So, and we'll talk about that in a later unit. But that tends to drop a lot of precipitation, and that's what lets them be so productive. So one of the reasons that primary productivity is so high here, apart from the fact that you have a long growing season, is that you have a lot of water. It takes water for plants to grow, and since there's a lot of water, there's a lot of plant growth. So they are quite productive, and as a result, there's quite a bit of biodiversity there. They typically are composed of conifers and some broadleaf trees. But one thing that's kind of cool about them, is true of other rainforests as well, is there's many what are known as epiphytic plants, plants that grow on other plants. They just, that any available space gets filled with plants. Now, did I already go over my 15 minutes? I'm almost there, and I'm not going to get through this. I told you I wouldn't. All right, temperate grasslands and scrublands. Now, look, that's a big chunk of the planet right there, people. Look at that. Basically, what we're talking about is prairies that have very few, if any, trees. But they're not deserts, but there's not enough rain to have trees here. So basically, if we look at a climate graph, what we need to notice here is that the precipitation is low. And if you look, you can't just compare one climate graph to the other because they tend to scale the y-axis a little bit different here. So we see here, this is centimeters. So at most, our rainiest time in this particular graph was a little over 12 centimeters, 13 centimeters. So it's not a lot of rainfall. So it's more than you get in a desert, but not a whole lot. So basically, there's enough rainfall to support small plants like shrubs and grasses, but not trees. the temperature can vary quite a bit. These grasslands are, as you saw in the previous slide, they're all over the place. And so you can imagine the temperatures can be very different in different parts of this. But the main commonality here is that there's just not quite enough. There's enough rainfall to have plants, just not enough to have trees. Okay? So these are quite common on our planet. They sometimes have hot summers and cold winters, but some places just have hot summers and don't really have that cold of winters. One thing that's really important to note here is that the soil here tends to be very rich in nutrients. And the reason is these plants that grow here are annual plants. They live for 1 year and they die. And then their plants, the roots just tend to rot in place and return nutrients back into the soil. Unlike a tree, which continues to grow and continues to take nutrients out of the soil, these are constantly dying at the end of each year, putting the nutrients back in the soil. So it turns out that prairie areas tend to be grasslands, tend to have very, very nutrient-rich soils. As far as biotic factors are, that they have a limited productivity, not because of a lack of temperature, but because of a lack of moisture. You can't really grow plants and capture sunlight if you don't have much water to do it, because it turns out plants need water. Now, so that limits the plant life to basically scrubs, grasses, and maybe a few small trees. You tend to get a lot of burrowing animals, gophers, in some places, meerkats and others, but they tend to burrow under the ground from protection from flying predators, and this tends to keep the soil well drained. You also have large herds of grazing animals that tend to trample the ground with their hooves. They tend to deposit a lot of nutrients or redistribute nutrients with their feces. And we find there's a fairly moderate amount of biodiversity in these. Ooh, gotta keep going. There's a lot of these. Darn it. Okay, so I promise the other ones won't take so long. Savanna, which is basically another word for tropical grassland. When you think of Africa, when you think of the Lion King, you're thinking of tropical grasslands, and these are very much like grasslands. With one difference is you do get some, because they have one very intense period of time where there's a lot of rain. That does allow for some trees to grow. The other thing is they don't tend to have the cold winter. So if you take a look at this climate graph, a couple things to notice. One is the temperature doesn't vary much. And the other thing I want you to notice here is the low temperatures are happening in August, September, July. So that tells me that this must be south of the equator. So it's worth noting that the cold months are when we would be having our warm months. So you should be able to look at one of these climate graphs and tell if this particular biome is located north or south of the equator. You notice here too is there's not a lot of precipitation most of the year. So we're talking like, what are we at, millimeters? We're talking about like maybe 13 centimeters of rain. All of a sudden you have this one brief period of time where there's a lot of rainfall. Abiotic factors, the low precipitation, the short wet monsoon season, and soil, again, is going to be rich in nutrients from all these decomposing annual plants. Biotic factors is we tend to have limited productivity because of our rainfall issue. But the other thing is we have large herds of migratory grazing animals. They tend to eat a lot of the small trees that might tend to grow. And we have moderate biodiversity. Man, okay, we're getting really close. Okay, how many minutes in? I'm at 18 minutes, darn it. Okay, so desert. If you look at the world here, there's a lot of desert here. All right, now desert, I think we all know what that means. So basically, desert is a place that has very limited rainfall. It doesn't have to be hot. It has to have very, very limited rainfall. And as a result, you have very little plant life and you have very nutrient-poor soils because there's nothing putting nutrients into them. Looking at a climate graph of a desert, we'll notice that there's very, very low precipitation. I look at this one here, and you should be able to look at it too and say, hey, I know that this is south of the equator because of when the temperatures are low. It can be cold in a desert, so you can have deserts where it gets below freezing. Don't kid yourself in that regard. That's not, being hot is not really a quality of a desert. Having low precipitation is. But abiotic factors, you have less than 25 centimeters of rain a year. We have typically very extreme changes in temperature between day and night, and that's because there's very little moisture to regulate that. And the main thing is the soil is extremely low in nutrients. It's often just sand, gravel, clay. Sometimes it has salt crystals in it, so it's really not conducive to growing plants. Biotic factors are basically very, very limited productivity, the lowest of all ecosystems, because there's just no moisture with which to grow plants, and those plants that do grow have ways of conserving water within them. So, like you have cacti that basically hold water within their structures, and then their leaves are curled up in these tiny spiky things to keep things from eating them. And there's very little biodiversity here. And now we get to everybody's favorite tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest is a biome that is limited basically to the equatorial regions of our planet, where we have very high rainfall, very thick vegetation, very high productivity. Because if you look at it, you can always spot these climate graphs because there's almost no change. And we'll learn why in this. There's almost no change in temperature at the equator, and the rainfall can vary. Sometimes it can be high all year. Sometimes it'll higher others, higher sometimes others. But if you look here, like we got over half a meter of rain in this month. We got a half a meter of rain this month. We're getting meters of rain here, people. That's the deal. Okay. Now, we have like up to 10 meters of rain a year. There's very little variation in the temperature, strong sunlight. Typically there's not much sunlight down below, which is kind of weird. So it's very intense sunlight up above, but the plants tend to grow a canopy, and the lower down parts tend to have very, very little, like only like 6% of the light that lands on a rainforest actually makes it down to the forest floor. Some of the biotic factors, and don't worry about this NPP. I left this in here, but we'll talk about that. I decided to put that later on in this unit. Basically, high rainfall allows for a lot of productivity, which allows for an amazing amount of biodiversity, the highest biodiversity on the planet. And we notice one of the things that we have here is there'll be many animals are adapted to living in the trees. And the other thing is there's a lot of symbiotic relationships between organisms. The organisms that are dependent on each other for survival have evolved together to be that way. Okay, and the last thing here is that this is a list of primary productivity. Remember, just think of primary productivity as how much of the sunlight that lands in the air it can be captured by plants. And so if you look here, tropical rainforests have a lot. Okay, we'll talk about these aquatic ones later, but you see like Savanna, Temperate, Grasslands, you're getting less. Deciduous rainforests get a bit. Polar tundra, not much, and deserts are absolutely at the very least. And so this would be a good slide for you to take a look at apart from the screencast, because I think it tells you a little pretty important aspect of how these different ecosystems are related to the amount of productivity that's possible where they are. So that's it. I am sorry that this one went as long as it did, and unfortunately you still have to watch the one on aquatic biomes. It's going to get better. Don't worry.